Hello from Salt Lake City, Utah, and welcome to our fourth plenary today. I'm Sara Yo, Associate Professor and Science Communication Researcher at the University of Utah, and I'm excited to be moderating this plenary to explore what sparks curiosity, wonder, and awe. Our speakers will share their knowledge on the current state of research about human curiosity, wonder, awe, and similar emotions, and we will discuss whether these are appropriate means of engaging publics with basic science. So we have two great talks lined up today and two additional panelists who will join the discussion. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to assure you that there will be time for questions after we hear from our speakers and panelists. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing your question into the Q&A section tab in the top right above your chat window, and we will do our best to get to your question. So without further delay, I am honored to introduce Dr. Tania Lombrozo, who is the Arthur W. Marks 19 Professor of Psychology at Princeton University, as well as the Director of Princeton's Program in Cognitive Science. Her research investigates the human mind, asking how and why we think and believe the way we do, including curiosity in the domains of science and religion. She received a PhD in psychology from Harvard University in 2006, after which she was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley, before moving to Princeton in 2018. Professor Lombrozo is the recipient of numerous honors for her scientific contributions, including awards from the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the National Science Foundation.
Hi, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to join you today for this session on curiosity, wonder, and awe. And I'm really happy to have an opportunity to share with you some research from cognitive science that has to do with how we might be able to stimulate curiosity about science. And what I'm going to do is focus on some opportunities that come from what we know about this research, but also some challenges in thinking about communicating science with the public. So I want to start with a point about the emotional life of science. I think the perception of science is something like this. People think about scientists as highly competent, but also cold and robot-like. Now, of course, those of us who actually engage in science know that the reality is more like this. Science involves all sorts of rich emotions. We experience curiosity and awe that often prompt us to pursue certain kinds of scientific questions. We experience confusion. We experience satisfaction when we come upon an elegant theory, a good result, a good idea. So contrary to this widespread perception, the emotional side of science is incredibly important to the scientific process. And increasing research also suggests that it's important to the process of science learning, in addition to conducting science itself. What I'd like to do today is focus on curiosity and tell you a little bit about stimulating curiosity about science. So first of all, what is curiosity? There are lots of competing definitions, but at their heart, they share the idea that curiosity is fundamentally a drive to know. But even this definition requires a little bit of refinement. So if you're filling out some paperwork and you aren't sure what's supposed to go on line 7, you might really want to know what you should put on line 7, right? So that you can fill out the form. But there's a sense in which you probably wouldn't say you're really curious about what goes on line 7. It's something that you just want to know or need to know to satisfy some immediate practical aim. Contrast that with the experience of observing brood X 17-year cicadas emerge from the ground in enormous quantities every 17 years. And that might lead you to wonder why they come out every 17 years and how on earth they keep track of time and all sorts of other questions about this natural phenomenon. And most likely, those questions aren't motivated by some immediate practical goal of learning about cicadas. You just want to know for the sake of knowing. So this contrast between instrumental goals for knowing something, where you're motivated primarily or exclusively by some immediate practical end, and non-instrumental reasons for knowing something, where at least you experience wanting to know something just for the sake of knowing it, is one of the things that people often highlight as a key characteristic of the experience of curiosity. You're really motivated to learn, and that seems to be driven internally by your own desires. One of the reasons why curiosity seems to be so central to both the process of science, but also science learning, is because we know that curiosity motivates inquiry. Let me just give you one concrete example of this. This is from a study that I was involved in with Emily Liquin. We got lots of questions, many of them about science, from a website called Explain Like I'm 5. And they included things like, why are most pencils painted yellow? Why do cubes crackle when liquid is poured on them? And so on. And we asked participants to tell us how curious they were about the answer to each of these questions. And later, participants had an opportunity to choose which information they wanted to reveal, where some of that information would answer these questions. And what we found was a very strong relationship between how curious somebody was about the answer to a given question and the probability with which they would later choose to reveal information that was relevant to answering that question. So more generally, we see that curiosity isn't just a mental state or an emotion, it's one that actually translates into our behavior. There's also evidence that curiosity improves learning. So let me give you one example of this. So in this study, participants were asked trivia questions like this one about what instrument was invented to sound like human singing. Participants would indicate how curious they were about the answer. They would also try to guess the results and be given the results. And they would do this for a variety of other questions as well. Now, 2 weeks later, participants were asked to recall the answers to these trivia questions. And one of the results was that participants were more likely to accurately recall the answers to trivia questions that they hadn't previously gotten right when they were more curious about the answers, suggesting that curiosity might itself be a causal driver of our ability to effectively encode information and retain it. Now, when people talk about curiosity in the cognitive sciences, they often make a variety of distinctions between different types of curiosity and so on. One distinction that I want to make today is between curiosity as a state versus a trait. So sometimes when we talk about curiosity, we talk about people who are very curious people. And indeed, there's really fascinating research on variation across people and the extent to which they tend to be curious. But there's also a variation within a person over time in whether or not they experience the state of curiosity, right? So over time, we experience all sorts of emotions. Some of the time, we experience curiosity. And so when we think about curiosity as a state, we can ask a question like, what is it that prompts curiosity about science, such that we can potentially stimulate that curiosity for any kind of person, regardless of whether or not they tend to be a curious person in general. So my plan for today is to focus on state curiosity. And in particular, I'm just going to give you some highlights from some recent research, giving you 3 pieces of good news about the potential to stimulate curiosity about science, and then some not quite bad news, but perhaps some challenges that we have to face. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, you will be curious to learn more and to engage us in discussion about these topics. So first, a piece of good news. There is lots of evidence going back for decades that curiosity is triggered by a large variety of different kinds of cues. So early research tend to emphasize the ways in which novelty or surprise or uncertainty or incongruity would lead us to experience curiosity. One particularly influential theory suggests that we experience curiosity when we perceive an information gap. That is a gap between our perceived current knowledge state and our desired knowledge state, such that we're motivated to try to fill that gap. Now, all of these can be understood as cues in the environment that might indicate that we have the potential to learn, right? When something is surprising or novel or incongruous, it's something that we don't entirely understand yet. And so you might think there's particular value to directing our inquiry towards those aspects of the environment because they have the greatest potential to teach us something new. And indeed, there's evidence that our expectations about learning are one of the primary predictors of how curious we will be about something. So let me give you one example of this from a recent study with Emily Liquin. Here, I know this is too small for you to see in detail, and that's okay. What I want you to get a sense for is just that we asked people to tell us how curious they were about the answers to a variety of questions, many of them about science, but some of them about other domains as well. And then across several studies, we saw which features of those questions were the best predictors of how curious participants were. And what I want you to focus on is that across a variety of studies, some of the 2 largest predictors of people's curiosity was what we called anticipated learning, how much they themselves expected to learn, and also learning potential, how much they thought that one could in principle learn from the answer to the question. Another large predictor, which we'll come back to in a moment, was future utility, their perceptions about how useful it would be to know the answer to that question. Now, the good news is that even though it looks like people really are very attuned to how much they expect to learn, there are some relatively simple ways to get people to appreciate that there might be some valuable learning to be had. So in a paper called Curiosity is Contagious, Ratchet Dubai and I looked at these questions. And what we did is that we presented participants again with a variety of questions. These were again taken from Explain Like I'm 5. And for each of these questions, we wanted participants to tell us how curious they were about the answers. The critical feature of this study is that we also included information about upvotes. So these were presented as if they were on some sort of social media platform where they could see how many other viewers had upvoted that question. And some questions were randomly assigned a very high number of upvotes. Some were randomly assigned a very low number of upvotes, relatively speaking. And the question was whether or not these upvotes, a sort of social cue from the environment about the value of some question, would themselves influence participants' curiosity. And what we found was that they did. Participants reported significantly higher levels of curiosity about the answer to a given question when that question was presented with a large number of upvotes versus a low number of upvotes. And that also translated into the probability with which they would later choose to reveal information relevant to that question versus other questions. A final piece of good news is that curiosity seems to participate in a virtuous cycle. So here's what I mean. In this study, we had a variety of questions and answers drawn from books of questions and answers. Some of them were about natural and social science, some of them were about history and other topics. And we had participants indicate first how curious they were about the answer to a variety of questions. They then received answers to those questions, and they told us how satisfying they found the answers. And finally, we asked them how curious they were about a variety of follow-up questions that were related to that question and that answer. So here's the cool result. We found that when people were more curious about an answer to a question, that tended to lead to greater satisfaction when they received the answer. And when participants found an answer especially satisfying, that tended to lead to greater curiosity about follow-up questions. And this is kind of cool because you might have thought that once you receive a satisfying explanation, you're done, you're satisfied, you don't need to learn more. And instead, what we're finding here is that receiving a satisfying explanation is actually really reinforcing. It leads people to want to learn more and inquire more. And so we're finding this sort of virtuous cycle whereby initial levels of curiosity actually promote greater curiosity downstream. So I've given you 3 pieces of good news. Now comes the mixed news. So I can motivate the first point I want to make here with a quote from several years ago from Sarah Palin. So she was criticizing the way that science funding mechanisms work. And she wrote that sometimes these dollars go to projects that have little or nothing to do with a public good. Things like fruit fly research in Paris, France. I kid you not. Now, there's a lot of things that you might take issue with in this quote, but it suggests an interesting presupposition. So first, there's just the factually incorrect idea that fruit fly research doesn't support the public good. But there's perhaps an additional idea here that research is only valuable insofar as it has an immediate and apparent benefit for the public good. So partially thinking about these kinds of questions and about theories of curiosity, we were involved in another study where what we did was we looked at the allure of instrumental value in promoting curiosity. And in fact, one of the things we looked at was curiosity about fruit flies. So we asked our participants how curious they were about the biology of fruit flies. And we asked them this question both before and after they learned some additional material about fruit flies. Some of our participants learned lots of interesting facts about fruit flies, and these were basically intended to be novel, surprising, and unexpected. Some participants learned about the ecology of fruit flies, and in particular, how important they are for the environment. And a third group of participants learned that they were very valuable, but for practical medical benefits for humans. So here we were interested in how these different kinds of information highlighting interest or surprise versus value, but not to humans, and finally value to humans, how that might influence people's reported curiosity about fruit flies. And here's what we found. Basically, all 3 of these passages actually did increase people's level of curiosity about fruit flies, but we found the most dramatic effects for that text that emphasized the medical or practical benefits of fruit fly research. The reason that I consider this a possible hazard is that it might be a challenge for stimulating curiosity about basic versus applied research. It's in some ways great that we can motivate curiosity about something like fruit flies by making the practical application salient. But one concern about doing that is that it could reinforce the idea that science is only valuable and only worth pursuing when it has immediate practical benefits. But of course, there's lots of value to basic research, even when we don't know what the immediate practical benefits might be. And so this really poses, I think, an interesting puzzle about how to motivate science in a way that's going to extend not just to applied research, but to basic research as well. The second challenge I want to talk about can be motivated by the Golden Fleece Award. So as some of you may know, in 1975, US Senator William Proxmire wanted to recognize those who were putatively fleecing taxpayers with unneeded research. And he did so by starting the Golden Fleece Award. And one of the first recipients was a set of researchers who'd received $84,000 from the National Science Foundation for research on romantic love. And Proxmire wrote something that I find kind of astounding. He wrote that the NSF shouldn't fund this, not just because they can't get an answer, but because he doesn't want an answer. He thinks that some things should remain beyond the scope of science. So this kind of sentiment motivated a research project where we looked at what people think does and doesn't fall beyond the scope of science. We presented people with a variety of phenomena you can see here on the x-axis. And for all of them, we asked them the extent to which they thought science could one day fully explain that phenomenon, and whether or not it made them uncomfortable to think that science could one day fully explain that phenomenon. And what we found was a range of different kinds of judgments across phenomena. I'm just showing you a subset here that fit on the graph. But for example, people had no problem thinking that science could and should fully explain depth perception. But some people thought that science couldn't. And in fact, they weren't comfortable with the idea that science could explain something like falling in love or belief in God. And I've plotted those comfort ratings here flipped to match the possibility rating. So higher levels mean that people are more comfortable. And as you can see, when you get to things like explaining falling in love or belief in God, at least some people are uncomfortable with the idea that science could offer an explanation. We also found that this was predicted by the extent to which they thought a given psychological phenomenon had a sort of rich first personal subjective experience, whether they thought it was unique to humans or made humans exceptional, and the extent to which they thought we had conscious will over that phenomenon. So I think this is a challenge for stimulating curiosity about some aspects of the human mind. It might be that in some cases, people don't think science can answer certain questions, and furthermore, might be uncomfortable by the idea that the scope of science could extend to cover that. So summing up, I've shown you that curiosity is triggered by a variety of cues, many of which indicate a potential to learn. I've shown you that curiosity is contagious, that social cues can be leveraged to boost curiosity about scientific topics. I've shown you that curiosity can support a virtuous cycle whereby curiosity begets further curiosity. And I've shown you that curiosity can be triggered by instrumental value. I think this is good in some respects, but potentially it's a double-edged sword if it might present a challenge for motivating curiosity about basic research. And finally, there's some evidence that people think that there are limits to what science can and should explain, and that might naturally pose a challenge to motivating curiosity and interest in those aspects of science. So I want to end there, but fortunately, this is not the end of the conversation. There is lots more research in this area, and there's a lot more to learn. And so it's my pleasure to hand things over to our next speaker, Daniel Silva Luna, who is a PhD candidate in science communication from the University of Otago. So please join me in welcoming Daniel. Thank you.
Kia ora. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Daniel Silva Luna, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Science Communication of the University of Otago. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to share with you some of what I've learned throughout my PhD studying the nature and varieties of awe in science communication. I want to start with the question, what is science communication? Science communication has been described in many ways. It can be described as the transmission of scientific information between different people, sometimes described in terms of deficit or dialogues. It can also be described in terms of its many formats, the science talk, the science podcast, the science exhibition. I personally like to think of science communication as a culture, as a place where a group of people share a set of meanings that they pass through social learning as they engage with different cultural practices and products. Many of these shared meanings have to do with scientific knowledge. So for example, we all share knowledge about the 8 planets orbiting around the sun or the DNA molecule. However, in this culture of science communication, we also share other forms of meaning that are not necessarily of scientific knowledge, such as values, beliefs, norms, and goals, or what I like to call cultural mandates. For example, most people in the culture value education or believe that science is important for society. More important for the purpose of this talk, in the culture of science communication, people share to a certain extent similar kinds of emotion knowledge. There are certain emotions that are valued in science communication, and we share ways of representing these. Suffice to say that the culture of science communication is not a monolithic entity, but rather I like to think of it as a mosaic of many subcultures. Subcultures which form, for example, around national or linguistic boundaries. So you might think of the subculture of science communication in Germany, or a subculture of science communication in the Spanish language. Subcultures may also form around disciplines, say, for example, health communication, environmental communication, astronomy communication, or they may form around different sets of cultural mandates, such as the goals of promoting careers in science, addressing issues of public trust, or fostering spaces of knowledge co-creation. People who participate in each of those specific subcultures will share meanings which are particular to those spaces. Again, it is worth mentioning that these subcultural spaces are not homogeneous and separate entities, but rather their boundaries are both arbitrary and leaky, with many bridges and trading zones through which meanings flow from one space to the next. Now, going back to the topic of the day, I want to quickly try to describe awe. So if you asked me 3 years ago, what is awe? I would have told you that there's this positive emotion you get when you see something that is big and that makes you change your mind. However, my current answer to the question, what is awe, is whose awe are you talking about? You see the celebratory awe of the basketball fan watching their favorite player lead their team to victory. You see the expansive awe of a devout individual transfixed in the meanings and symbols of a religious ceremony. Is it the melancholic awe of an environmentalist mourning the scale of the devastation we have brought upon the oceans? Or is it the quotidian awe that a poet might find in the simplicity and beauty of a flower? I argue that depending on whose awe you're talking about, this emotion is going to be a very different thing. So last year, we published an article titled The Construction of Awe in Science Communication in the journal Public Understanding of Science. In this article, we argued, among other things, that there is a convergence in a lot of the literature on emotion from psychology, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and history around the idea that emotions are biocultural constructs, meaning that people's emotions are not innate, but rather they learn their emotions from their context they navigate from birth. And this applies to all emotions, including happiness, sadness, fear, and in our case, awe. As one of the most famous researchers on emotion, Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, author of How Emotions Are Made, argues, infants show no evidence of being born knowing awe, meaning that people don't carry some sort of awe program in their heads that the things in the world just activate, but rather, we argue that awe is a culturally and historically contingent emotion category, always specific to the English language. Awe is not the same as asombro in Spanish, or Ehrfurcht in German, or hushu in Turkish, or ikei in Japanese, or any other translation. All these words have come to acquire some of the meanings of awe through cross-cultural dynamics such as migration, translation, and trade, but they are not the same. These other categories have their own histories and their own local semantic realities. We also argue that awe is learned and developed as a skill in socialization practices and interaction with cultural products. People get better at awe the more they interact with that category and practice such emotion. Moreover, we argue that the experience of awe is the result of the combination of evolved domain general processes such as language, affect, and conceptualization in the in-culture brain, and their expression is a socio-communicative practice in the world. An awe experience happens when a person uses previously learned emotion knowledge of awe and conceptualizes a situation as awesome. This is a process that is automatic, dynamic, predictive, and active, mostly unconscious, and thoroughly grounded. More important for today's topic, we argue that different cultures have different types of awe. Whether it is certain religious communities, the tourism industry, wellness culture, the world of art, the sports industry, pop culture, or many other cultural spaces, they all have their own versions of awe. One such cultural space with its own versions of awe is the culture of science communication. One of the reasons I got interested in the topic of awe was because I noticed that many famous science communicators love to talk about awe and wonder. So Rachel Carson talked about the wonders of nature. Richard Feynman talked about the awe he gets from physics. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the awe-like feelings he finds in astronomy and cosmology. However, I noticed that they were using very different language to describe these emotions: contemplation, beauty, humility, excitement, mystery, spiritual reaction, majesty. These words mean very different things. So why do science communicators refer to all using such variety of language? As part of my PhD, I went out and had in-depth interviews with science communicators trying to answer the question, how do science communicators talk about awe? I talked with 22 practicing science communicators in different countries who practice science communication in English and asked them about awe, how they experience it, how they use it, what they think about it. I analyzed their interviews using both content and thematic analysis, looking for differences and commonalities in their descriptions, and I found that there are no common elements that apply to all descriptions of awe in science communication. For example, the interviews described a large variety of accomplishments, living organisms, natural objects, artifacts, practices, ideas, and people both related to science and not related to science as the sources of awe. From architecture to acrobats, from black holes to moss, anything can be potentially described as awe-inspiring. Similarly, awe experiences happened in all sorts of social contexts, whether alone, with one other person, in a small group, or within a large crowd. Also, awe was described mostly as a positive emotion, but sometimes it could come with negative valence. And sometimes awe was described as arousing or exciting, and sometimes as a calm and soothing experience. The same diversity in the descriptions of people experiences and practices apply to all other elements of a situation, including the appraisals, motivations, expressions, actions, settings, background events, and outcomes. So variety is the norm. All experiences and practices occur in all sorts of situations. There is no one single component that applies to all situations where people experience and practice all in science communication. However, these descriptions of all were not random. Some of the components coalesced into themes or scripts, or what I like to call Autypes. Importantly, each of these Autypes is held together by a certain set of cultural mandates. In my analysis of the interviews, I identified 5 major Autypes in science communication and 3 minor ones. So, for example, the belief that science should be fun and available to everyone is accompanied by versions of all around the goal of entertainment. A surprising explosion, an astounding fact, a creepy crawler, all is there for people to be happy and excited and enjoy. This was one of the most common types of awe I found during the interviews, and however, many of the interviewees seem to struggle with this kind of awe. First, this kind of awe was described as overused, as hyping things up, and as distracting people from the actual science. Moreover, some of the interviewees described that the struggle they have in the attention economy and its relentless competitions for eyeballs, which makes this version of awe the default for many science communication activities. Another description of awe is tied to metaphors of science as a journey and to the belief of and the value of learning. The script for awe here is that of a powerful emotional encounter that happens at the end of a journey and which makes people crave for more information, a motivational account that can be described as curiosity. This creates a feedback loop between awe and curiosity, where curiosity begins a journey and at the end of it, an awe experiences its price. Awe is a reward for the patience of sitting through the whole science story, the hard work of solving a scientific puzzle, the discipline of waiting for that perfect scientific picture. I believe that this curiosity awe nexus is at the center of much of the culture of science communication and co-constructs many people's identities within this cultural space. A third common script comes with the belief of science as inherently awe-inspiring, but also describes science as difficult and as something reserved for experts. The function of awe is to inspire admiration and devotion towards science and reverence towards scientists and their products. Descriptions of Einstein's work, the images of the Hubble or the Large Hadron Collider as genius, marvelous, awe-inspiring, construct much of the veneer and respect that science gets in our societies, while precluding much critical engagement with the topic. Another type of awe comes associated with the belief that science can in some way replace religion, together with ideas about awe being some sort of emotion, the summit of some sort of emotion mountain, as something that is very difficult to achieve and that happens only once or twice in a lifetime. These beliefs comes with narratives where at its climax, an awe encounter results in epiphanies and revelations that set a person into the path of science. While mirroring traditional Christian motifs of conversion into faith, these narratives of awe come peppered with religious vocabulary of spirituality and transcendence. I also observed that the belief that in modern life people are alienated and disengaged from their environment, coupled with ideas about awe and emotion that can be easily found in picturesque, mundane, or beautiful encounters with nature, comes with descriptions of this emotion as something that can foster a sense of connection. Science, in its ability to defamiliarize even the most mundane objects, can help foster the sense of awe and wonder in the quotidian, in the mundane, in the beautiful. This version of awe is closely aligned to the construction of environmental identities and beliefs. Some other smaller scripts for awe that I observed in the interviews were related to national pride. I'm in awe of the science my country does. Humility. I'm in awe of our insignificance in the cosmic scale. And imagination. I'm in awe of the potential science fiction scenarios that we can imagine. So my overall findings were that awe in science communication is neither monolithic nor a random event. I identify at least 8 scripts through which practitioners talk about different experiences and practices of awe. These, I argue, refer to very different kinds of situations. Some of them describe situations that are popular, frequent, fun, entertaining, while others describe them as lonely, one-off, quasi-mystical, revelatory experiences. These, I argue, are very different. Each of these Autypes assumes its own forms and serves distinct functions, whether it is motivating learning through curiosity, assigning value to scientific objects through admiration, or fostering a sense of connection to a community or the environment. Each of these Autypes has a different set of outcomes. More important, these Autypes contribute to the constitution of the different cultural mandates that circulate in the culture of science communication. For example, versions of awe around the theme of humility constitute norms and values that are disinterested and cosmopolitan. By contrast, awe mingled with national pride reinforces parochial or hubristic beliefs, such as those of manifest destiny. These various Autypes indicates the existence of many science communication subcultures that form around these mandates. Similarly, the Autypes describes also co-constitute the practices of science communicators and the identities of people within this space. Whether it is deficit style activities or an identification as an environmentalist, or is the emotional scaffold that holds together many practices and identities in science communication. Finally, it is worth pointing out that this taxonomy of Autypes presents idealized types that do not capture the many idiosyncratic ways in which people experience and practice awe. All experiences and practices are always situated, amalgamating in all sorts of ways to serve a function in relation to the moment when this emotion is represented. What I presented here is all groundwork for future research that moves away from simplistic and narrow ideas about this emotion in science communication and into thinking of it in all its diversity and color. Thank you.
Wow, so these talks give us a lot to think about and discuss. But our two speakers are joined by 2 additional panelists, Gina Garbarino and David Kirby. Before I introduce Jeanne and David, however, I want to share some of Daniel's bio, which we didn't get a chance to hear. As Daniel mentioned, he is a PhD candidate in science communication at the University of Otago. He holds a master's in science communication from Imperial College London, an MA in international relations from Koç University, Turkey, and bachelor's degrees in economics and political science from Universidad de los Andes, Colombia. So next, Jeanne Garbarino is the director of RockEDU Science Outreach at the Rockefeller University. She works to promote and support science outreach within the scientific community, open channels for everyone, scientists and non-scientists alike, to develop an appreciation for science as a human endeavor, and to provide equitable access to scientific resources and opportunities that genuinely reflect the process of science. And last but not least, let me introduce David Kirby, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies in the Liberal Arts at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo. His research focuses on how the stories we tell about science impact our perceptions of science as a social, cultural, and political force. His book, Lab Coats in Hollywood, Science, Scientists, and Cinema, examines the collaborations between scientists and the entertainment industry. He is currently writing a book titled Indecent Science: Religion, Science, and Movie Censorship. So to get the ball rolling on our discussion, Jeanne and David, I'd like to invite you to share your thoughts on the topic of our sessions and the wonderful talks that we've just experienced. David, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I say I'm a science communication scholar, but my research, it focuses on the way in which entertainment media serve as vehicles for science communication. So mainly thinking about television and movies. So when we're talking about awe and wonder in the context of mass media, right, it's about communicating notions of awe and wonder to very large and very broad audiences, right? The bigger, the better when you're on movies or when you're on television or in movies. Daniel, he mentioned in his talk that entertainment is one of the 5 main ways that science communicators situate awe, and one of the most sort of common ways that he. So entertainment media can actually be conveying the awe and wonder of science to audiences. So, who was not in awe when they first saw those realistic dinosaurs walk across the screen of Jurassic Park? Or again, who was not in awe of science and scientists when they saw, Mark Watney survive alone on Mars in the film The Martian? And as as Watney sort of famously told us in the film, the only way he was able to survive was to, quote, science the shit out of it, right? So in my research, I found that when we're discussing entertainment media, science can be incredibly beneficial, both for the entertainment industry and for the scientific community, right? So science, it helps media producers use authentic science to make their texts more dramatic, more interesting, more entertaining. But it's also the case that the stories, they can convey the excitement of scientific research and communicate about the natural world, and especially our ability to understand the world. And that, of course, is a good thing. But also, I'm hoping we can talk about in the discussion a little bit as well, is that some people who look at science and media might think that we're in a case of what we might call wonder overload. It is sort of omnipresent in the landscape of science and media, especially in recent science documentaries like the Cosmos reboot that Neil deGrasse Tyson was involved in. And when wonder is deployed in a lot of these documentaries, right, it's meant to foster an appreciation of science, right? But often that appreciation sort of turns to worship of science. When wonder and entertainment, it sort of gives us a false impression that scientists are never wrong and that uncertainty isn't a process of science. So I'm hoping that maybe this is something we can talk about as well in our discussions. Is there a case where you can have too much wonder when you're trying to get people to appreciate science? Thanks. I'll toss it over to Gina.
Jeanne, you're muted. Just. Still. Nope, we can't hear you. Hey, my apologies. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but thanks for hanging in there and sticking get around to this question of is there a point at which there's too much wonder, right? But while we're waiting for Jeanne to reconnect here, hi.
Hi, I'm back. I'm so sorry. We spent a lot of time in technical rehearsal making sure that did not happen. But thank you so much for having me. And I think it's a real pleasure for me to be here because I read the work of Tania and Daniel, and we at RockEDU, we lean on the social science research around wonder and awe to construct our summer biomedical research program for high school students with an idea to make sure that we're building a research program that's inclusive, and that is authentic to biomedical research. And I think that by asking our students what they notice about the science that we're mentoring them in, and then encouraging them to wonder about this. And sometimes we have to give our students the permission to wonder outside of sort of that box that they feel science has to be sort of fit inside of very neatly, like there's these perfect ways of knowing, and to wonder about something somehow translates to this like imperfection about knowing, and that feels terrible for them. So what we try to do is promote them to wonder about things that they notice, while also engaging them in cultural sort of like norms that we try to co-create with them, such as, you know, accept non-closure, which is a really big thing of science. And also there are many ways of knowing, you know, we each have a positionality, we know a certain thing, we know very little as an individual, but together we know a lot. And so combined with all of this, and just to also address like the concerns that I think Daniel has brought up in his talk about the sort of like the negative elements of promoting too much wonder, I think that's really tempered, because what we're talking about is like, you know, I wonder how the pH is going to change the structure of this protein as it's, you know, spun out of a silkworm. You know, that's the scope that we're talking about. And it's been really powerful to draw on, you know, what kids are wondering about, so that they can build this research project under the mentorship of scientists who helped them to shape it into something very rigorous. And so just by promoting that information gaps exist, as Tania had suggested in some of the research that she had just explained, we try to really leverage the idea of these information gaps and normalize that information gaps take place in science, and encourage the kids to wonder about these information gaps, and to explore them in ways that feel genuine and authentic to both themselves and the process of science.
Thank you. So we have a lot of really great questions from the audience, but I'll start with some specific questions for Tania. There are questions about, can you maybe speak to the demographics that were involved in some of your studies, and the diversity of the demographics? And on a related note, are there common characteristics in people who are more curious? So the trait of curiosity.
Yeah, those are great questions. So in most of the studies that I've run in my lab, we've collected data from a combination of online platforms like Online Mechanical Turk and Prolific Academic, which draws on a fairly diverse group of people in terms of age, but less diverse along other dimensions like socioeconomic status and political orientation and so on. And so as a result of that, we're somewhat limited from the work that I've done in looking at questions about demographic variation, because those studies aren't really designed to get at that. But fortunately, there is a lot of research that has tried to look at demographic variation in characteristics like curiosity, to some extent in awe as well. I mean, you saw some of that in Daniel's research, and there's a little bit of additional research in that direction. Part of the complexity is that there is not really consensus on how you measure a person's level of curiosity or a person's level of op-proneness. There's one paper, for example, that summarizes measures of curiosity, and it finds about 30 different ways that people have measured an individual's tendency towards curiosity. And as soon as you dig into it, you realize there's all these different flavors of curiosity, and they're not necessarily all the same. And so it turns out to be a little bit complicated, but some of the most consistent findings are that curiosity is related to the personality characteristic referred to as openness to experience, and also related to sensation seeking. So sort of being, you can think about it in relation to something that came up as a theme already. Curiosity and awe can be experienced in a positive way. You're really motivated to learn and to figure stuff out, but also in a negative way where you realize you're being deprived of something, that you don't have something you want. And so that might be one of the important individual differences underlying that, is that if you're the sort of person who kind of revels in the new and are comfortable in a situation where you don't yet have everything figured out and where things are novel and unfamiliar, you're going to be more likely to have a sort of positive orientation towards curiosity and to experience it frequently.
And sort of on a related note, I suppose, if you spark curiosity, right? If you create that gap in what you already know and what you want to know, but then do not satisfy it, does that have a potentially detrimental effect on future curiosity?
So I don't know of a study that has looked at that directly. If other panelists do, I'm hoping they'll weigh in. I can tell you some indirect hints. So I think it is likely to be detrimental if people give up on the possibility of having an answer, right? We tend to experience curiosity as more positive when it feels like the answer is attainable to us, right? You can think about it a little bit like hunger. Hunger is actually kind of pleasurable if you know you're about to have a fantastic meal, right? You know you're going to really enjoy that meal. It's sort of a nice feeling of anticipation, but it's also a really aversive feeling if you don't think it's going to be satisfied at all or anytime soon. And so I think the conditions under which it would be detrimental is if somebody is really curious, and it's not just that they don't have the answer, but that they don't feel they have the potential to get the answer. And I think that's the state that we would want to prevent.
This is related to a little bit to what Jeanne had mentioned about sort of giving your students permission to wonder about something.
Yeah, I can follow up on that, but I don't have, I'm not a social science researcher. I don't study wonder and awe. I just try to use the evidence for building good programs. And I think it's really important that we're leaning on these types of data to do this work, because science is indeed a human endeavor. And for us, I think it can be really frustrating for our students to realize that science is a process. Our summer programs are usually like 7 to 10 weeks long, or maybe our after school programs are, you know, a total of 100 hours from like, you know, January to June. So the students are not actually spending a large amount of time doing science. So we try to temper their expectations, and instead we never actually focus on product whatsoever. We only focus on process. And we, you know, again, every day when I meet with my students, I say, okay, I'm re-upping this norm. We're accepting non-closure. Science is about failure. Science may not have a complete story. That should not stop you from trying to learn about what this thing is that you're really interested in, right? And so from an anecdotal perspective, as long as it's reinforced in these other supportive ways, I feel that wonder can be super powerful in cultivating I mean, maybe I'm making a jump here, but I'm really interested in actually knowing if we cultivate this wonder and we encourage the skill or state of curiosity in our students, as was put previously, can we develop a stronger science identity in our students? And those are questions I'm really interested in exploring.
Sort of along those lines and cultivating and learning or emotions, a question came in for Daniel. Is the learned nature of awe applicable to other emotions, do you think?
That's a debate in the science of emotions that I'm not going to get into. There's currently a very long-held debate between those who believe that there are some emotions that are natural and are everybody has them, they're universal across across all humans, and there's another group that says that no, effectively we learn all emotions, including sadness, fear, happiness, and all those considered basic emotions that we learn them from our culture and we pick them up as we grow up. So yeah, I'm on the side of the emotions are learned, but this is a long debate.
Yeah, and you know, sort of along those lines, how do things like wonder and awe and curiosity differ between children and adults, right? Because I think we have some sense that these might be different. So someone in the audience asked that children show awe, but often in ways that confuse us as adults. Is it because they haven't learned, as you've been saying, common cultural practices around it? And how do you think that might affect science communication with these different audiences?
I can say something to that.
Yeah,
Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, there's not a lot of research on children experiencing awe, so I wouldn't be able to say whether children do experience awe or not. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't seem like it. They experience maybe curiosity, maybe engagement, maybe surprise, maybe kind of what in psychology called prediction error. They're very prone to prediction error. So I think awe is wrapped up in so many cultural values and norms and mores that yeah, we learn those as we grow up, and then our the bafflement of the person that children's awe might be just that, must be like that cultural difference between being an adult and being a child. Tania?
I'll second what Daniel said. And I think, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research on children and awe specifically, but there is more research on curiosity in children. And there's some evidence, I will say it's not overwhelming evidence, but there's some evidence that over the course of development, you find curiosity going from more unfocused to more focused on specific topics, and also from being less instrumentally driven, so more just about learning for the sake of learning, and becoming more instrumentally driven, where it's more about your immediate practical goals. So some evidence supports that. My empirical bet, unlike Daniel's, would be that children do experience awe, but again, it gets a little bit complicated because we have to be more precise about exactly what we mean by awe, and all the nuance that Daniel brought up. But one reason to think it might be different for children is that one way to think about a difference between curiosity and awe is that both involve confrontation with something you don't know the answer to. But in the case of awe, you might appreciate that you don't even yet have the right conceptual tools to make sense of it, right? That coming to terms with what you're trying to understand, or this gap, might require what psychologists sometimes refer to as conceptual change, right? Not just learning a new fact, but acquiring some new concept, like the concept of density, for example, that children don't start out with, they have to learn that. And so to the extent that children don't already have the right toolbox for understanding the world, in the same way that adults don't have the complete toolbox for understanding the world, they're going to more frequently be confronted with these kinds of situations where they might not have the right conceptual toolkit. And so that's why I would predict that maybe children are going to experience awe more frequently, and also under different conditions than adults, because both curiosity and awe are going to be a consequence of the relationship between your experience and what you already have in terms of your mental models of the world, right? So to the extent you have learners, individuals with different mental models, they're going to be experiencing these emotions under different conditions.
Thank you. That's great. So I want to pose a question that has come up several times in the Q&A. And I think, David, you alluded to this earlier in your comments, but what is the relationship between faith and curiosity? A lot of science, the person posing the question asked, a lot of scientists I know are not people of faith. Is there a space for faith and curiosity to coexist? And I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I would say that certainly there can be a relationship between faith and curiosity. And there's research coming out by Elaine Ekman, wrote a book about scientists and faith. And there's a lot more scientists who see themselves as religious than many people think is the case. But in terms of the science theories in particular, they often frame the notions of wonder around things that we would thought of as sort of religious element, as sort of almost spiritual element, which is why I sort of see a danger of it tipping over when you talk about this sort of wonder overload, that becomes a reverence rather than a sort of belief in science, worshiping science to believe that science works as a process. And in these science documentaries, I know Neil deGrasse in Cosmos, when he saw faith in science, he talked about faith having what he called hopeless wonder, right? The idea that you can wonder with, but you can't do anything about it, as opposed to regular wonder for scientists can actually go and do things. Now, I would just a bit with sort of notion, but in the media, that is, that is sort of one of the ways in which they play science against religion.
Can I say something? That's why I think the question to Tania about who were the people that participated in this experiment was really interesting, because I do think there's elements of, there are different cultures that conceptualize curiosity differently, and there's some cultures that promote curiosity, and I think science communication is one of those spaces where curiosity is promoted, and we talk about curiosity often, but there will be other cultural spaces, and I think of faith communities, certain faith communities that will see wonder, curiosity as something to be, to move away from, to something that we don't want in our group, and so yeah, I'm very curious about like what are the cultures that promote, what are the cultures of curiosity, and which are not the cultures of curiosity, and comparing around those.
So many great questions and so little time. I do want to pose a question that some have asked about how and if misinformation campaigns tap into people's feelings of wonder and curiosity and awe. Thoughts on that?
I mean, I'll say that this is certainly true when you think about the ways in which people go through media, right? It's about media as a sort of field where, you know, the people who draw in the most views win. One of the ways to do that is through awe and wonder, and that's why these science documentaries have moved more to that. I mean, there's sort of wonder escalation as well, because you can bring in viewers through those situations. And even if it's not true, if you can get people wondering about it, oh, there's a secret cabal running the world, that's amazing. You're going to draw in readers and viewers.
I'll add one more thing to that. There was a really interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago that linked scientific curiosity to reduced effects of polarization in terms of attitudes towards science. So people who were higher on scientific curiosity, as reflected in things like consuming science-oriented media, tended to show less differences across ideological lines in terms of their attitudes towards climate change, for example, and other issues as well. It's one study so far. I don't want to make a conclusion that goes beyond that. But to me, it suggests a really interesting possibility that the kinds of characteristics that emerge when you experience curiosity and when you're the sort of person who's curiosity prone might be the kinds of characteristics that make you less likely to consume and share fake news and misinformation just for the sake of the political or social signaling that comes along with that, right? You might be the sort of person who actually engages with it more critically and shares it for other reasons or doesn't share it for other reasons. So that's intriguing and I think promising, and suggests that there's a really interesting connection worth exploring further there.
Great, thank you. And so we have only a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to go around our virtual room here and think a little bit about some practical things you might say to our viewers who are interested in tap curiosity or elicit awe and wonder. So Gina, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, so based on some of the work that we've read about in our literature journal clubs with my team, we think about the noticings and wonderings as a protocol, or the 5 whys as a protocol, and we just try to integrate that into our mentorship practice. And so more specifically, we have a biomedical research program that supports high school students through remote research. And we currently have 5 research tracks going on right now as we speak. But we trained the mentors for 10 months prior to their participation in this. And we trained them specifically to think about prompting wonder as they pushed their sort of research frameworks out there for the students to consume. And so I'm happy to, it's a little bit more, I don't think I can get very specific right now in the time that we have, but if anybody ever wants to learn about the things that we're doing to promote rigorous biomedical research in a remote capacity in a student's home while prompting wonder, these are things that we are having a lot of fun with. So happy to talk about that further.
David?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I mean, certainly not everyone's going to be able to make a Hollywood movie or a big science documentary, but, you know, YouTube is a great place. I mean, don't underestimate the power of using visual media to try and provoke awe and wonder, or even podcasts and things like that, or just general storytelling. So there's lots of ways to use entertainment in order to generate those awe, wonder, and curiosity.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah, so one thing that David mentioned was how awe was used in the sense for entertaining people, but sometimes some of the people I interviewed saw that as something to move away from because it might hype up science and it might create all this too much wonder, too much awe. But I think that has to do with this romantic notion of awe being this one-off thing that happens once in a lifetime, and you climb up a mountain and you're changed forever. So my suggestion would be not to shy away from those popular, engaging, entertainment forms of awe, even if it's on the small scale. I think they are more democratic, more participatory, more engaging, and fun for people.
Wonderful. Tania, in maybe 10 seconds?
10 seconds. I just want to point to the idea of curiosity being a kind of virtuous cycle, right? Often in order to be curious, you need to know something first. And so I think curiosity isn't always the starting point. It might be what you want to induce in an appropriate way and then generate that cycle and get it going.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists and our speakers. We've had a great conversation today. And today overall has given us a lot to think about. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow's conversations. Thank you for attending on behalf of our organizers and for sharing the day with us. We hope to see everyone back tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern with our first plenary of the day. How can we ensure public engagement in basic science is equitable and inclusive? Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, panelists and speakers.